Reports are emerging of another school shooting today. Early reports out of Pittsburgh. 3 people have been shot at a high school there. The police right now are searching for the shooter in the woods surrounding the high school. We hope and we pray that the 3 reported victims will survive. But this is just becoming a regular part of our work week here in Washington. We can expect at some point during the week that we are going to turn on the TV onto one of the cable news networks and find a live report from a school or a mall or a church somewhere out in this country where a shooting is in progress. It's happening at a rate that I don't think any of us could have expected. And this number, Mr. President, is growing at a rate that I don't think any of us could have expected. I brought this chart down to the floor of the Senate now for going on about 6 months since the failure of our common sense anti-gun violence bill this spring. And this number represents the number of Americans who have died through gun violence since December 14th. December 14th means something to everybody in this chamber, but certainly to those of us from Connecticut, that's the day in which 26 6- and 7-year-olds and the teachers that protected them died in Sandy Hook. 10,000 people, 465 additional have died. And I've been trying to come down to the Senate floor since the failure of that bill to just try to tell the stories of these victims. Because if statistics don't do the job, if the sheer numbers alone don't convince people that something should change, well, then maybe hearing about who these people are might change things. We hope that we won't add to this number with some new young victims from the reported shooting in Pittsburgh today. These shootings happen in unlikely places. Schools now, unfortunately, are a likely place for a shooting to happen because they seem to happen with some regularity in schools, in part because we do very little, if anything, to stop them with legislation from this chamber. But they're happening in other unlikely places as well. Clubs, for instance, in New Haven, Connecticut, have been the sighting 4 times just this year of major shootings. Just a few weeks ago, on October 26th, police in New Haven responded to an early Saturday morning shooting at a place called the Key Club Cabaret. They got there and found that 26-year-old Erica Robinson had been killed in a shooting spree that also injured 19-year-old Amanda John, 29-year-old Jihad Brumsey, 24-year-old Nijia Ward, and 34-year-old Albert Dickerson, as well as 25-year-old Yvette Sterling. Officers rushed to the scene as hundreds of patrons were running out. They walked in and found 6 victims of gun violence. Just a dispute in a club resulting in the death of Erica Robinson and several more being injured. Just a few days ago in Cypress, Texas, there was another shooting in a club in which 2 high school students were killed and 19 others were injured. Actually, this was at a house party. Shortly before 11 p.m. on November 9th, 2013, there was a house party celebrating a young woman's 18th birthday. And because of a local dispute between 2 rival groups, Querick Denarius Bernard Richardson, 17 years old, was killed, and Ariel Shepard as well. According to authorities, Richardson was shot in the head while he was running away from the house party. When students returned to school on Monday, there was a lot of crying as they mourned the death of 2 of their classmates. school parties celebrating 18th birthdays, clubs in places like New Haven, Bridgeport, Connecticut, places you don't think that you're going to end up being shot at when you walk into, are now the scenes of pretty vicious shootings, as are our schools. And, Mr. President, shootings are increasingly happening in another way as well, by accident. I, unfortunately, in preparation for a lot of these speeches, rifle through a lot of pretty grisly reports. And increasingly, you're seeing more and more accidental shootings ending up in tragedy. In Waterbury, Connecticut, again, just a few weeks ago, Dow Kling and Sean French, both 22 years old, were playing around with their .22 caliber Ruger inside an apartment in Waterbury when the gun went off and Dow was shot to death. His best friend, Sean French, who shot him, said, "I'm sorry. I wish it was me and not him. I wish I could trade places with him. I really do." A week earlier in Henderson, Nevada, just another example by which Sharice Pincombe was playing around with a gun with her friend Colin Lowry, and the Remington 45 was loaded, and they didn't know it was loaded and shot Sharice dead. 23 years old, described as an amazing coworker, so caring. She was kind. She was always helpful. She always wanted to do something to help out. She was just generous. And just because they didn't understand the gun was loaded and they were being reckless, playing around with a firearm, Sharice is dead. And so that's why people out there don't understand why we can't have an honest conversation about changing things. And even when those conversations are attempted to take place, they get shut down and cut off. A pretty innocent op-ed piece in the Guns and Ammo magazine just suggested that maybe people should get a few hours of training before they get a concealed carry permit. And as a consequence of running that editorial, the editor of Guns and Ammo had to resign and step down simply because he ran an op-ed by an author that suggested that maybe people should get some training before they have a concealed weapon. And so even when we try to engage in these discussions, we can't have them because the folks that get their money from the gun industry, whether it be the NRA or these magazines, aren't even allowed to have these conversations, despite the fact that 84% of gun owners support universal background checks, despite the fact that 50% of gun owners support a restriction on high-capacity ammunition clips, despite the fact that 46% of gun owners think that it's a good idea to ban high-powered assault weapons. Organizations like Guns and Ammo or the NRA are out of step with gun owners who don't want to see this number continue increasing, who don't want to turn on the TV to see another school shooting. The reason that I come down here, Mr. President, to talk about who these victims are is because the conscience of this nation should be enough to move this place to action. And it's about time that gun owners and non-gun owners alike get together to do something about this. There is much more agreement than there is disagreement amongst both people who own guns and people who choose not to own guns. And whether it's background checks or a ban on illegal gun trafficking or just a simple requirement that you get a little bit of training on how to use a gun so that you don't fire it accidentally and end up shooting your best friend, there are simple, common sense, bipartisan things that we can do to make sure that this number doesn't continue to accelerate at the pace that it has since December 14th. I thank the chamber for its time. I yield back and note the absence of quorum.